In 2008, I fondly remember buying the collectible tin with Montage Dragon in it and taking it to my local tournament. I had been sort of kicking around all of these schoolyard duelists at the time, and I figured that my Montage Dragon deck was ready to take on the local tournament scene. However, at the first duel where I actually got to summon Montage Dragon by discarding 3 monsters in my hand, even though I was able to get a pretty sizable Montage Dragon, it had over 4,000 attack, I promptly ran it into a Sakuratsu armor and quickly understood why Montage Dragon wasn't actually good for my strategy. Sadly, despite the fact that I still like Montage Dragon a lot and have tried to put it in a couple sort of for fun strategies, the fate of many Montage Dragons out there is very similar to the one that I found when I ran it into any number of trap cards. In today's video, I want to talk about why nobody plays Montage Dragon both in the TCG and Duel Links, and I know this might seem like a weird card to pick for this series, but what's interesting is that Montage Dragon on paper solves many of the issues of cards we've already talked about. Things like the Egyptian God cards, things like the Sacred Beasts, things like the Wicked Gods. Montage Dragon, even though it isn't competitive and hasn't ever seen competitive success, at the very least does solve many of the problems plaguing those big boss monsters. So we're going to talk about in today's video why it's not just enough to actually solve some of the issues with these big monsters, but also go above and beyond if you want to be a competitive Yu-Gi-Oh card. First off, let's read Montage Dragon so that we get the full picture without missing any portion of its effect. Interestingly enough, most of the text of Montage Dragon isn't actually related to its on-field or in-hand effect, it's just relating to its summoning condition. So it can't be normal summoned or set, and it must be special summoned from the hand by sending 3 other monsters from your hand to the graveyard, and cannot be special summoned by other ways. So almost all text is just explaining how you summon it. You can only summon it through the means via its own effect, and you can't bring it back with something like Monster Reborn, which is probably okay because it wouldn't have any attack points anyway, because this card's attack becomes the combined original levels of the sent monsters times 300. That means that if you send a whole bunch of big monsters, this thing can actually have a pretty ridiculous amount of attack. That sort of helps you cheese out some wins with this card. It's not the worst card I've ever seen. However, this card is fundamentally flawed in the same way that many of the Egyptian God cards are, and that it takes too many cards to actually bring this out without enough of a payoff. And in today's video, we're going to explore that a little bit further. First off, I don't think it's actually that crazy to say that Montage Dragon is better than the Egyptian God cards. It suffers many of the same downfalls of those cards, but it actually improves on many of the worst aspects of the gods. For example, one of the biggest problem with the Egyptian God cards isn't once you get them on the field, it's getting them on the field in the first place. It's not easy, even for decks that turbo them out, to actually put 3 monsters on the field and then also be able to normal summon the Egyptian God cards, versus a Montage Dragon where you don't have to put cards on the field, you can just discard them and then summon it immediately. It is a heck of a lot easier just to have 3 monsters in hand than it is to actually have 3 monsters on the field. Obviously, cards like Scapegoat and then making Link monsters is a pretty fast way to make the Egyptian God cards without losing a ton of cards in the process, but just in general, Montage Dragon is a heck of a lot easier to summon, and I think that we have to give it credit where credit is due. However, just like the God cards, except for Obelisk, Montage Dragon also suffers the same fate where it doesn't really have protection. I've mentioned this time and time again, but Ra and Slifer, outside of their normal summon protection, don't actually have any way to prevent them from being destroyed or bounce back to the hand or just run over in battle. In general, the only God card that has seen play competitively is Obelisk, mostly due to the fact that it's a 4,000 attack monster that can't be targeted by your opponent's card's effects. Montage Dragon does not have this protection, which means it's kind of under the same category as Ra and Slifer, and I would say in general this shares the most similarities with Ra because they both would be played in similar style OTK strategies, although once again I would have to give Montage Dragon credit. I think it's a lot easier to actually OTK with this card than it is the Winged Dragon of Ra. However, even though it sounds like I've just praised Montage Dragon up until this point, keep in mind this card still isn't quite good enough to see competitive play, and in fact suffers many of the issues that I see with custom cards that people make, in that this is nothing more than a big monster. And don't get me wrong, big monsters are really cool. Blue Eyes White Dragon is an iconic monster, if not the most iconic Yu-Gi-Oh card in the entire game, and it's just a big vanilla beater. But Montage Dragon doesn't have nearly as much support as the Blue Eyes strategy, therefore this thing doesn't ever do anything more than just be a big body. And in that regard, there are much better cards out out there, especially considering this card requires you to discard 3 cards from your hand to the graveyard, and unfortunately it isn't technically worded as a discard, it's worded as a send, which means it won't trigger things like the danger monsters, which would be a hilarious combination with this card if it had been worded different. In general though, sending 3 cards from your hand to the graveyard to summon a card that doesn't gain advantage in any way, shape, or form is a pretty bad deal. Let's compare Montage Dragon to similar cards, first starting off with cards that are just big monsters that you can summon from your hand for basically free. And I know that every time that I make a video talking about cards like Montage Dragon and like the Egyptian gods that take 3 monsters to summon, I always get a couple comments, just a very small amount of comments from people saying things like, well Doug, what's the difference between a Montage Dragon taking 3 monsters out of your hands to summon and something like Trishula taking 3 monsters on your field to summon? Both of them are -3s, both of them require you to invest a bunch of monsters. What's the difference between these cards? Well, first off, Trishula and any extra deck monster isn't actually as much of a minus as summoning cards from your hand because you're not actually losing any hand advantage to bring it out. To summon a Trishula monster, you start with 3 cards and end with 1 card, so it's actually just a -2, whereas to summon a god card, you start with 4 cards, the 3 tributes and then the god card, and then you end with 1 card, so it's a -3. So extra deck monsters in general aren't nearly as much of a minus compared to cards in your hand that you're summoning via tributes or discards like Montage Dragon. But more importantly, you don't have to draw Trishula or any extra deck monster when you can't summon them. You can only bring them out when you need them, unlike the Egyptian god cards, unlike Montage Dragon, unlike any card in your main deck where you have to draw it even in the hands where they're not good. This is actually one of the biggest problem with the god cards, is that you don't always have the opportunity to summon them, which means if you have them in your opening hand and you can't bring them out, they're just dead draws that could have been other cards. In the case of extra deck monsters though, that's not a thing that you have to worry about, which leads players to play cards like Trishula, where if those were in the main deck, maybe they wouldn't play a similar card if they couldn't bring it out as easily and as readily as Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. So I know that that comparison seems pretty straightforward, but for many commenters, or I guess just a couple commenters, they seem to be confused at why that's a difference, so hopefully this explained it enough for you guys asking that question. One of the fairest comparisons to make to Montage Dragon is another card release in 2008, and that's Guardian of Order. This card actually preceded Montage Dragon, was released as a sneak peek promo in Light of Destruction, and in many ways the cards are played in similar strategies. Guardian of Order was commonly tested in light-based OTK strategies, and it's a big level 8 monster that you can summon from your hand for free, unlike Montage Dragon, which requires 3 cards. So Guardian of the Order allows you to special summon itself from your hand if you control 2 or more light monsters, and that's it. It obviously does restrict you from having multiple copies, but you're never going to have multiple copies of Montage Dragon because you'd have to have 8 cards in your hand to do that, and that's just not very likely. So the Guardian of Order sort of restriction there doesn't really matter when compared against a card like Montage Dragon. The big difference though is that Guardian of Order does not require you to send cards from your hand to the graveyard, which means if your opponent hits this with a bottomless trap hole, they've only done a 1-for-1 trade, where if they did it against Montage Dragon, they essentially got 4 cards of yours gone just for that 1 bottomless trap hole, and that puts you in a very unfavorable position. If we look at more modern cards, there's actually one card out there that compares really well to both Guardian of Order and Montage Dragon, and that is the Ascended of Thunder. So unlike Montage Dragon, this card does not require you to discard or send cards from your hand to the graveyard, and unlike the Guardian of Order, it doesn't require you to have any setup prior to summoning it. All you have to do to summon this level 7 2700 attack monster is pay 3000 life points, and technically it does have an effect that lets you gain back 5000 life points, but that doesn't really matter. If we just look at this card as a level 7 monster that you can summon from your hand by paying 3000 life points, it looks really good compared to Guardian of Order and Montage Dragon. Obviously it's a little unfair because it's a card released in 2017, I believe, or 2018, compared to cards released in 2008. So 10 years does make a huge difference, but just in general, I want to show you another card that sort of looks like those previous 2 cards from 10 years prior, but is a lot better in many ways. But this got me thinking, is there a way to actually make a Montage Dragon light card be competitive while still keeping the send cost? And there is. In fact, it's already happened, and that is Mermail Abyss Megalo, one of the deadliest Mermail cards out there right now, and that technically, if you look on paper, has a very similar summoning requirement to Montage Dragon. Just like Montage Dragon, you send cards from your hand to the graveyard to do something, in this case special summon the cards. However, the difference is that not only does Megalo search a card when it's summoned, but also the cards you're discarding are usually Atlanteans, which immediately gain advantage by blowing up your opponent's cards or searching a card from your deck to your hand. So in most cases, Megalo is actually not a minus, it is just an even in card economy. Usually the cards you discard blow up cards, and maybe some case just one of them blows up a card, but as long as you search one card and blow up at least one card, you didn't actually take a minus in card economy to summon Megalo. And in the cases where you are searching a card and triggering 2 graveyard effects, you're actually gaining advantage. You're getting a +1 overall, which means that Megalo obviously is way more powerful than Montage Dragon, not to mention the fact that Megalo has an on-field effect that lets it attack twice. I want to compare Montage Dragon to Megalo though, because like Montage Dragon, Abyss Megalo doesn't actually have any protection either. However, if your opponent bottomless trap holes the Abyss Megalo, you're still triggering the search effect, you're still triggering the graveyard effects, which is something very different when compared to Montage Dragon. To further support my analysis of Mermail Abyss Megalo versus Montage Dragon, we can actually look at a Mermail monster that was released that's a lot closer to Montage Dragon and therefore never saw any competitive play. The level 7 2500 attack Mermail monster, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce, the whale one, requires you to discard 4 other Mermail monsters, which is actually 1 more than Montage Dragon, and then it has some bonus effects that destroy cards on the field and do some other cool things. However, this card ended up not seeing any play. It saw some experimentation with more casual versions of the strategy, but in terms of competitive validity, this card didn't really see much success, and that just kind of goes to show that when you have someone discarding 3 cards or 2 cards or 4 cards, it matters not only the card quality of what you're discarding, but also what the card itself does. In the case of Megalo, it's getting you searches, it's getting you destruction effects with the Atlanteans. In the case of this whale Mermail monster, not only are you not even allowed to discard Atlanteans, but the advantage gaining effect is much more disruptible than the Megalo effect and also requires there to be a much bigger board. Megalo will always search something regardless of if your opponent has any cards, where in the case of the whale, it doesn't actually get value unless you're destroying cards on your opponent's side of the field, which your opponent might not always have. So in general, it's kind of cool to look at that we have 2 Mermail monsters that are both very similar and do trigger effects. I mean, some of the Mermails actually do have effects that will trigger off of this, but in general, they're not as high impact as the Atlantean monsters. So both of these cards are sort of the same, but one of them is a lot better than Montage Dragon, whereas one of them is a lot closer to Montage Dragon in overall power level, which in this case isn't a good thing because Montage Dragon isn't very powerful. At the end of the day, Montage Dragon is much better than many of the monsters that I reviewed in this series. It's certainly better than cards like the Sacred Beasts or the Wicked Gods or the Egyptian Gods, but it's still not quite good enough to be a competitively viable card. If you take anything away from this video, it's that if you're building a deck, you want to have as many cards in your deck that have lower costs with higher impacts. Montage Dragon certainly does have a high impact. If you manage to actually summon it and get an attack to go through, you'll usually just OTK your opponent, but the cost of the card is simply too high to even play in a 2008 metagame, therefore the card is simply not good enough. You want to play cards that have a low investment so that if your opponent disrupts them with any number of hand traps or regular trap cards, you don't lose so much in the process that you can't continue playing the game. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed this discussion on why nobody plays Montage Dragon, a card that I am very fond of and have a lot of awesome memories from casual Yu-Gi-Oh, but unfortunately, like many cards in this game that are iconic, Montage Dragon simply doesn't have enough tools at its disposal to be a competitively viable card. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.